everybody. Welcome to PRIMO NUTMEG, media for free minds. I'm your host, Steve. You know, over the past 2 years, I've had a lot of big guests on the show. Noam Chomsky, John McAfee, Hoyce Gracie, Ralph Nader, Jake the Snake Roberts, Jason David Frank, Jill Stein, and many other legends. But today's show is particularly special, as my guest today is one of the greatest musicians of all time, Donovan. In the 1960s, Donovan was one of the most famous musicians in the world. His songs Catch the Wind, Sunshine Superman, Mellow Yellow, and Hurdy Gurdy Man won him international acclaim. Donovan also collaborated with some of the greatest musicians of that era, including the Beatles, Joan Baez, and the future members of Led Zeppelin. Beyond being an inductee into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Songwriters Hall of Fame, Donovan is also an advocate of transcendental meditation and the bohemian lifestyle. It was truly an honor having Donovan on the show this week. And one quick reminder, folks, if you do enjoy this interview, please show your support by subscribing to the PRIMO NUTMEG YouTube channel. That way you can stay up to date on all of our latest shows without having to dig around and wait for them to be released. And of course, please also subscribe to PRIMO NUTMEG on SoundCloud and iTunes, and follow PRIMO NUTMEG on Twitter and Instagram, and like PRIMO NUTMEG on Facebook if you have time. Thanks again, folks, and without any further ado, here is the Prince of Flower Power, the one and only Donovan. Donovan, welcome to PRIMO NUTMEG.
Hello, good day. I'm on my way. I'm coming your way.
Yes, you are. You are playing a show tomorrow night, Saturday, at the Guard Center in New London, Connecticut. And this is the 50th anniversary tour of Sunshine Superman, correct?
That's right. It's taken 2 years to do this 50th anniversary. It's such a lot of areas to cover. And these are the last concerts, actually. And I've come back particularly to reach some areas in America that my fans said, why don't you come up and see us? So we decided to add a few, and that's why I'm coming to see you guys.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's going to be a thrill to see you in person. You are a musical legend. And I actually just wanted to ask you briefly a little bit about some of my favorite songs of yours. So one of them in particular is Universal Soldier, which you released in 1965. That's a real favorite of mine. So I was just wondering if you could speak to what caused you to release that song back in 1965.
Well, it's one of the very rare songs I didn't write. I got really into an artist called Buffy Sainte-Marie. She's a Canadian-American Indian gal who arrived on what we call the folk scene in the early 60s. Buffy recorded and composed and a set of songs which were quite amazing. And one of them was Universal Soldier. Now, I took to it straight away. And when I recorded it, it did cause some friction on the radio in Britain because, well, a lot of people thought I was putting down the common foot soldier. You know, I was against these young men and young women who were going to war. Well, of course, Buffy's song is not about against anything. It's really pointing out that it is always the common foot soldier that takes the heat. And that's a few things. Oh, and one of the early videos we did, one of the early videos in the music world, actually, of my period, we went to the beaches of Normandy with D-Day. And when the promoters of the single, my label, Pi Records, and my manager, Ashley Kozak, when they were promoting, the BBC took me to the beaches of Normandy, and for 3 days in a row, there was filming. And then 3 weeks before the release, there was great headlines in the pop music saying D-Day is coming, D-Day is coming. And finally it came. I think it's a very powerful song. It means the same thing now as it always did. I love Buffy Sainte-Marie's work, and this one in particular. It's still very popular, of course.
Yes, and sadly I think it becomes relevant every few years when there is another conflict. But
bringing you back then to the 60s, you were one of the first pop musicians to really embrace the counterculture. So what happened personally for you where you started getting involved in this flower power scene?
Well, I come from what they called the underground in the 60s, and before that it was called the Bohemian world. The Bohemian world of art schools, the Bohemian world of poetry groups and jazz and blues clubs. In that world, we we read a lot of books. Out of the art schools came everything that was going to happen. I believe in America too, certainly in Europe, and definitely in Britain. Because in art school, the girls were more interesting in art school. The boys were more interesting to the girls. But it was more than that. In art school was everything. It was jazz and blues and folk. There was poetry, painting, and pottery. There was philosophy, literature, and yoga, and books. And lots of the books that we read of the old Bohemians, they spoke of yoga and Buddhism and the power of the inner world of the human being, which was entered by meditation. And it was the Beatles and I especially saw in each other's songs that we were headed in the same direction to try to study what was going on. And one of the actual symbols of the Eastern form of yoga is the awakening of enlightenment and consciousness. The higher consciousness is symbolized by the unfolding flower. But flower power, the actual phrase, was coined, I believe, by Allen Ginsberg to illustrate the unfolding of the higher consciousness, which was the 60s theme, really, when you look at it closely. But at a concert, I had 7,000 blue iris flowers in a mandala on stage in Hollywood Bowl in 1967, and I do believe that's when they coined me the Prince of Flower Power.
So you also were one of the first British pop musicians to get busted for smoking cannabis. Could you explain what happened in that? Were you targeted? I actually heard that in that instance that cannabis might have been planted on you.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing new. Cannabis and marijuana has been around in the jazz world for a long while, and around in the world in general for thousands of years, considered a healing plant in most of what we call the old cultures. It was around, Jamaica, man, and ganja, and part of the bohemian scene. A kind of just a very normal thing to have around. But it was really not only that the drug squad were formed to try to stop what was called the revolution of millions of young people rising in Britain, all over Europe and all over America. You know there was a new generation after the Second World War come up and wanting to try to find answers. And so I was a voice, and I had to be stopped, silenced. And Sergeant Pilcher was appointed in the drug squad, and he was searching particularly to bust the singer-songwriters of Britain. And it looked like, well, it was true. It looked like in my songs of 65, I was singing of the alternative society about to emerge onto the scene in music, then onto the lifestyle and popular culture in general. And so I was targeted, as you say. But that night, we didn't have any. And Sergeant Pilcher got busted in 1972 for planting drugs on us singer-songwriters in Britain. I was the first. It was obvious I would be. After that, the Beatles. After that, the Rolling Stones and others.
One other question on the Beatles. Is it true that Paul McCartney does the backup vocals on your song Mellow Yellow?
Well, no, but he was in there. He was in the session, okay. And he joined in the general party feeling and the solo. No, that little backup was me. But Paul and the boys and I, we were very close very early, and we did visit each other's sessions, yeah.
So, another question just about your fellow musicians there. Is it true that you paid Jimmy Page $1 to play on Sunshine Superman?
That I did what?
I heard that you paid him $6 to play you on that song.
Okay. In those days, Jimmy had gone back from his from his early Yardbirds days, he'd gone back to being a session guy. He was a pretty good session guy. You know, everybody's got to pay the bills. And in those days, sessions, you might look at it now, were actually very, very cheap. But my father, who worked with me for a couple of years and was very supportive, he was a bit of an amateur poet and monologue a performer on stages in the amateur sense of the word. He kept, when he traveled with me, my father, he kept a lot of stuff. And when I got it, many years later, his archive, I looked into it, and there was Jimmy, £3.10 for a 3-hour session on Sunshine Superman.
Well, that's a bargain, I'd have to say.
Yeah, of course. But of course, money was different then. You know, you could actually, come on, you could buy a car for £300 and a house for 3,000, or an apartment. The money was a different number then.
Well, you were actually broke at the time that Sunshine Superman became a #1 hit, weren't you?
No, not really. But there was money, of course, but we never saw it. You could talk to any of us of that generation from 62 onwards who was powerfully successful in the music business. We never really had any money to speak of in our pockets. But when Sunshine Superman, the album was finished, Gypsy Dave and I, my best friend, my producer Mickey Mouse, and all around us and our friends, when they heard it, said, this is a breakthrough album. This is extraordinary. But Big Alan Klein, the manager who had taken me on to place me with Clive Davis, who had just become the head of Epic Records in Columbia, Alan Klein quite correctly needed me to go to a supersized label in the States. Columbia would be that label, CBS. But as soon as that happened, boom, there was a lawsuit. And Sunshine Superman, in all its glory, the album, was placed on the shelf. It is now seen, of course, Sunshine Superman as the first psychedelic album, good year before anybody else, especially before Sgt. Pepper. But what happened in that lawsuit, Gypsy Dave and I said, that's it, we're going to go back on the road. We used to hitchhike, Gyp and I, with very little money. And we this time had a bit of money and took a trip to Greece. And way down there in Greece, we didn't need much money. There was just an idyllic island called the Isle of Paros. And on that Greek island, there was one telephone, and it rang one day in our exile. And it was my manager in London. He said, get on the next plane from Athens. Sunshine Superman's just been released. It's #1 all over the world. And so we looked in our pockets. We put the money on the table of the little taverna in the small Greek island. And Costas, the tavern owner, said, okay, boys, what was that call about? And Gypsy said, Costas, we've got a #1 record all over the world, and we've got not enough money to get on the ferry back to Athens. So we had taken down with us a very special new briefcase. That briefcase had a vinyl record player inside, a turntable inside the briefcase with a cassette player. And we only had three albums. The White Album was Sunshine Superman, the first Leonard Cohen album, and Revolver by the Beatles. And Costa said, okay, boys, you give me the briefcase record player, I give you the money to get to Athens. So, yeah, we were broke. We're broke with a #1 record. Reminds me of that story of Buddy Holly driving around with the band in Texas and hearing his first record on the radio, and he didn't know it was released.
Mm-hmm. Well, Donovan, I know that we're almost out of time here. I know that you are a busy man, but there is just one last question I do have to ask you because, you know, I was born in 1986, but I'm not really drawn to the music of my time. It never really struck me as meaningful or interesting. And I look back to the music from the 60s, from the 70s, and it was a lot more experimental. It was a lot more psychedelic. It was just interesting. Some of the songs had aspects of classical music. And I'd be really interested to hear your input on why you think the music industry has changed so much and maybe what made that era so special. Is it technology? Was it the use of psychedelics? What made that era of music so much better, honestly, than the music that's coming out today?
Well, I guess you got to think of the times. You know, there was in the 20s after the First World War, jazz came, and you see on the on the movies, the skirts got shorter, the haircuts of the girls got shorter. Jazz and dancing became amazingly popular. But in the 60s, it was a different kind of revolution. After that Second World War, what's called Bohemia in America, you called it the Beat Generation. There was going to be an invasion of popular culture. Of course, rock and roll had its own place in the 50s, you know, but it didn't really, in the lyrics, speak of anything what you'd call social or spiritual or mind-changing or life-changing or ecological or groundbreaking or peace or it didn't have anything in it that was what you might call I don't know, what you might call world changing. But then when the 60s came, millions of people, like in the 20s, there needed to be a new way of looking at things. And we came along. But out of the bohemian world of the art schools, as I say, the change was coming. And if you want to look at it simply, they called it the folk invasion, didn't they? The folk world took over the pop world, and lyrics became more serious and more fun too. But we're actually still experiencing that, of course. The 60s hasn't really gone away. It opened a door, a huge door, and there was a terrible need, and the Beatles and I understood it very well. And Linda, my darling, did it, and others of a conscious nature realized there's going to have to be something put into the schools for the future, or else the planet Earth is not going to survive in the decades ahead. There was a great need, and the words love, peace, and meditation became very, very important in the 60s, and still are, of course.
Well, Donovan, I'd love to have more time to speak with you. I know that you but at the show tomorrow night, will we be hearing the songs exclusively from Sunshine Superman, or will there be some of your newer music as well?
No. Well, what we're going to do. What we're going to do tomorrow is what I've been doing for 2 years. The whole idea of an anniversary sent me all the way back to those first two albums in 1965, which are very seminal to me and to others that we knew in those days. So I'm going to dip into 65, and I'm also going to play all the hits, and maybe a new one or two. But I've got so many songs that are historically known, I'm going to stick to what people know. Everybody will be satisfied. We're having a great tour.
Awesome. Well, I'm certainly looking forward to that. And Donovan, it has been an honor to have you on PRIMO NUTMEG today. I really do appreciate your time. And again, I'm really looking forward to tomorrow night.
Thank you.